The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield, offering assisted living and compass memory support with evidence-based treatment for those with memory loss. More at armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. I'm Carrie Saldo. It's Friday, October 10th, 2025. Our panel this week on the phone, John Micek, politics editor at MassLive, and joining me in the studio this morning, Aprell May Munford, Springfield Republican reporter.
Good morning.
And political consultant Evan Garber of A.L, Cignoli and Associates, which typically works with Democrats. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And if you have thoughts, be sure to email therundown@nepm.org. That's therundown@nepm.org. Coming up later in the show, we will dive into a controversial immigration resolution in Holyoke and the potential impact of MGM casino mitigation funds drying up for Springfield and other neighboring communities, and more. But first, with a peace plan within reach, the region and the world marks 2 years since war broke out between Hamas and Israel. The New York Times had this to say this morning. Israel's government on Friday approved an agreement brokered by President Trump that paves the way for a ceasefire in the 2-year-old war in Gaza and the return of all remaining hostages held by Hamas. And it was just 3 days ago that on October 7th, Jeanette DeForge reported for the Springfield Republican, quote, the Jewish Federation of Western Mass hosted events in Amherst and Springfield to mark the second anniversary of the October 7 attack on Israel. And as part of her reporting, she talked about how award-winning journalist Yardina Schwartz spoke about her book to the congregation. The book is Ghosts of a Holy War, which looks at the roots of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Quoting here, in interviewing Palestinians and Jewish people who were living near each other, Schwartz said she was struck at how similar they were in many ways. So many of the people who are considered enemies have so much in common, but it is the corrupt leaders who want to stoke the conflicts between the two, she said. Evan Garber, reaction to this, if you've been watching, President Donald Trump, obviously a heavy hand in bringing these two sides to the negotiating table, something that we didn't see President Joe Biden. He and his administration were not able to achieve that. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are approaching this with a sense of cautious optimism. There's been many ceasefires over the history of this conflict. And I think that people cautious optimism, and they're looking into what's coming next. And I think that coming next thing is how do we recover from this, not only kind of as a global society, but also the people on the ground there. There's massive humanitarian work that needs to be done to fight the hunger disaster that is happening in Gaza right now.
Mm-hmm. A lot to still be worked out. And I think I heard you, John Micek, there on the phone. Can you hear me? All right, we'll work to get John Micek on the phone, Bart, right? There was support from ABC News reporting across the globe. We saw British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres all issued statements praising President Trump and included an appeal to Israel and Hamas to abide by the terms of this agreement because we have seen previous agreements fall apart. Backstory on all of this from the Associated Press. The war, which began with Hamas's deadly attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, has also triggered other conflicts in the region, sparked worldwide protests, and led to allegations of genocide that Israel and the United States deny. In Israel's ensuing offensive, more than 67,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza and nearly 170,000 wounded, according to Gaza's health ministry, which doesn't differentiate between civilians and combatants, but says that around half of those deaths were women and children. And directly relating this to Western Massachusetts, we saw protests in our region. We saw calls for divestment, for any support of weapons manufacturers or any sort of faction supporting Israel. This resulted in stark divides on several college campuses here across Western Massachusetts, most notably UMass Amherst, which had very violent protests on the campus. John Micek, can you hear me? All right, we're still working on bringing John into the conversation. But as I said, we saw deep impacts here in Western Massachusetts. Evan, what are you thinking?
Yeah, these protests that happened here and around the world really showed that people have a great interest in this. People who may not be daily affected really felt the hurt of all sides on this. And, I think, like you said, these protests were there partly because of so many times the previous ceasefires had been violated. Israel violated the previous ceasefire at least 962 times. So we're everyone involved with this has so much generational trauma, and it's very difficult to work through. But again, I really think that we have to look forward. We have to look to the next day, and that's the over 2 million people in Gaza who are in at least emergency levels of malnutrition. And really, international aid needs to be allowed to flow freely into the Gaza.
And there was reporting in the Springfield Republican about attempts to bring supplies to Gaza this week. Aprell, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to mention, there's no way that these deaths don't touch us on either side. There's a lot of deaths. And it goes from micro to macro. Maybe it's over there, but we know people here. My partner's coworker might have gotten stuck over there because the airports were shut down. So this affects us in our everyday lives. And so I think people are taking the deaths into consideration, and they want to see the ceasefire happen now. And they hope that it's sustained.
Yeah. It's certainly something we will keep watching. We're going to move on now to some reporting, Aprell, that you brought to us out of Holyoke this week. A controversial immigration resolution in Holyoke was narrowly defeated, and you reported on this for the Springfield Republican. This was a long and at times contentious meeting there in Holyoke on Tuesday night, but help us by getting started with the backstory. Why was this resolution even proposed to begin with?
So in May, the Trump administration had listed Holyoke as one of 11 cities that had blocked federal immigration. Mayor Joshua Garcia publicly disputed this claim, and since the list has been revised. Now, only Boston is considered a sanctuary city on this list. However, there are other communities in Massachusetts like Amherst, Northampton, that has claimed that they were sanctuary cities. They're not on this list. However, Holyoke ends up on this list. So the resolution urged city departments to follow federal immigration laws when applying for grants, and stating that Holyoke is not a sanctuary city, which it's not. It also asked for departments to use this as a guide when they're applying for grant applications. And it was cited that in the resolution that it supports the mayor's public stance cited in 2017, a city ordinance requiring officials to follow all laws. In September, Mayor Garcia responded to the order by saying that the immigration policy is the mayor's responsibility and not the city council's. And he reaffirmed a 2014 order from Mayor Alex Morse that says Holyoke will not hold people for immigration violations unless a person is the subject of a criminal warrant. Maybe they were indicted, arraigned, or convicted of a criminal offense, or is a registered sex offender.
And as I recall from your reporting, the counselors who brought this forward were concerned because Holyoke had ended up on this list, and then obviously they were taken off of it, but that raised alarm bells for them. They're thinking there's tens of millions of potential federal dollars on the line here, right?
Yeah, and so they are worried about being a sanctuary city because we see cities and towns all over the country getting their funding taken back for not abiding by the federal law. And so they are definitely concerned about that. However, there are people in the community that says the resolution supported ICE. And they're saying that that's a misinterpretation of the resolution. And they...
Can anyone hear me?
Yes, John, we can hear you. We'll come to you in just a second.
Yeah, so they say that the resolution is meant to protect Holyoke from being wrongly labeled as a sanctuary city, which could put that federal funding at risk.
Gotcha. John Micek, are you there on the line? Can you hear me? We're talking about the status of Holyoke being concerned that it was labeled by the Department of Justice at the federal level earlier this summer into the spring as being a sanctuary city. But as we know, Northampton and Amherst are among the communities in Massachusetts and here in Western Mass who have declared themselves sanctuary cities. So, Evan, a bit of a head scratcher for me that the DOJ drops this list saying, look, your federal funding could be on the line here, Holyoke, but Amherst, Northampton, not mentioned a bit, not trying to call out Amherst and Northampton and start trouble for them, but there's a discrepancy there.
Right, and I think that really shows just the absolute lack of any control or competence in our current federal administration. And some of the counselors on the topic of federal funding being at risk, some of the counselors that supported this resolution said that if it gets defeated, the people who voted against it are responsible if the funds are lost. And really, the only person responsible for these funds being lost is the president. And I just think that the leadership, especially from the city council president around this issue, has been outstanding of trying to literally hold the city together on this. And look, some of the people who attended these meetings are really engaged about this issue, but also it's making them think about Holyoke politics more broadly. So I really think that this upcoming election season in Holyoke is going to be very interesting. I mean, the mayor doesn't have an opponent, but he opened a campaign office.
Are you doing any campaign work just in the interest of full disclosure for him, or?
Not on the campaign side, no. So he's running this campaign totally in the interest of helping the city come together so they can actually move forward and focus on issues that matter.
And for instance, this conversation was over 2 hours, and it was already in the DGR committee the night before, and the city needs to pass the Modern Finance Reform Act. Mm-hmm. And so these things
the DGR is a subcommittee that took a look at this issue before it advanced to the full city council. Yes. For me, zooming out on this, I really am having trouble still wrapping my head around the fact that the Department of Justice at the federal level called out Boston. Obviously, Holyoke ended up on the list accidentally. But it's very inconsistent list for me that I do not understand how they're targeting whom and why. And the pressure campaign has worked in at least one reported instance. In July, Mayor Craig Greenberg of Louisville, Kentucky, overturned its sanctuary city stance following a letter from the Department of Justice threatening potential legal action. So there are potential real-world consequences for having this designation and this delineation, and yet we see cities here in Western Massachusetts saying, you know what, that is not as important to us as the idea of us being a welcoming place, being a sanctuary city, because earlier this year we saw Pittsfield and North Adams and Greenfield declaring themselves sanctuary cities for transgender individuals, so going an additional step to say, this is a place where we want you to feel safe and welcomed. Any final thoughts on this, John Micek? I don't know if you can hear me there on the line. We're still working on looping you into the conversation, and we surely will. I'm going to take us to a break here this morning on the Rundown. Stay with us because we will be back to talk about the MGM Casino neighbors preparing for the likely end of the Massachusetts Gaming Mitigation Fund and why a soft secession might matter here in Massachusetts. You're listening to the Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. Good morning. You are listening to the Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I am Carrie Saldo, joined in studio by journalist Aprell May Munford and political consultant Evan Garber. And we hope to have John Micek from MassLive, the politics editor, on the phone. Fingers crossed that we can work that out. All right, I'm going to move us on to reporting by Jim Kinney from the Springfield Republican this week. The headline, going bust. Casino neighbors prep for an end of mass mitigation fund. Quoting Kinney's reporting here, the mitigation fund was one of the casino-funded programs directed to host communities like Springfield and surrounding cities and towns that suffer the effects of being near a casino. Going on in his reporting, it funded improvements like the redone Court Square Park in Springfield, paved bike paths through the town common in West Springfield, and added more transit service and green space to Everett Square. But now the mitigation fund is going bust. Nod for the casino reference there, Kinney. State lawmakers redirected casino tax money to statewide priorities in 2 consecutive budgets. The budget zeroed out the fund, which was directed at communities near the casinos. The MGM and Encore casinos, but not Plainridge, still pay the tax, but the money goes to statewide transportation, economic development, and tourism funds, according to the state budget passed this summer. Evan, this has some people in Western Massachusetts pretty worried.
Definitely. I mean, this fund, the way that I have been looking at it, was kind of for Western Mass, like getting reparations almost from like helping to bring our region up, which often gets overlooked in the state. But also, like you said, it's Encore, the Boston area, and Plainville. And, you know, we've hit really difficult times. We were just talking about federal funding in Holyoke. That federal funding is also affecting the state budget. Budgets need to be balanced. Obviously, transportation is a really important issue for many people across the state. But I mean, this was money promised, and to have it taken away like this without seemingly much of a public kind of debate about it, it is a bit concerning because it shows priorities are shifting in this difficult financial landscape.
It was interesting because we had Jim Kinney and former State Senator Eric Lesser on the program back in June when Kinney kind of tipped the hat to the fact that this could be happening. And it was then that former State Senator Eric Lesser pointed out that, look, these funds were sort of meant to pave the way, smooth the roads, if you will, for people to feel comfortable with MGM coming into downtown Springfield. There were concerns that there were going to be massive traffic backups, all sorts of snarls. So that's why we saw a lot of these funds going to things like fixing rotaries, changing traffic patterns, improving roads, because we're seeing some increased traffic. But we're certainly not seeing the snags and snarls that people were very concerned about. Some of this money went to West Springfield, Aprell, and you report on West Springfield. What are your thoughts?
I think that if we're looking at what the money is used for, like Memorial Ave, that needs to be done, and that's a consistent road that's traveled. West Springfield is considered the crossroads of West Springfield, the crossroads of Western Massachusetts. There's a lot of traveling happening. They need that money. They need that money, especially when funding is being cut.
Yeah. WLLP was reporting on Thursday that the Springfield City Councilor Sean Curran wants Governor Maura Healey to restore the $3 million in casino mitigation funds, which have been cut from the state budget. State Senator Adam Gomez, a Democrat of Springfield, told Jim Kinney that the delegation is going to press the Healey administration. But as you pointed out, Evan, budgets are so tight and revenue uncertain. And we've seen in the last several budget cycles sort of hinting that maybe these funds were going away. Do you think there is any chance that there's political will for this?
It's definitely going to be an uphill battle, just because looking at where these funds impact, which is, you know, obviously here around the Encore Casino, there's more representatives and senators in the Mass General Court that their districts don't see anything from this money than there are. So that's going to be a tough vote, but I think
and that's
it can
always
happen.
a tough slog for Western Massachusetts, whether
Right.
we're talking about funding for rural transportation, for education. I mean, total pivot from what we're talking about, but it's one of those things that where there's this perennial argument about making the case for Western Massachusetts.
Right, and you know, you got to recognize that the state can't pick up the tab for everything that's being cut from the federal government. You know, and I've heard from some people inside the Healey administration that it's going to be really difficult for everybody to parse out what can we save, what the state can pick up the tab for, and what we might have to go without in these difficult times that we're going through. But it's so much more, though, than just like infrastructure and road building. Funds went to the Holyoke Community College Workforce Development Program, which really I don't know how it's going to go on without, because the lion's share of their money did come from it. And also programs from the DA and the Hampden County Sheriff's Office, programs like substance abuse awareness and treatment, which honestly I think we need now more than ever, as we're in this mental health crisis and substance abuse crisis still.
Well, it will remain to be seen if the money is potentially clawed back. But as Jim Kinney reported this week, the money as it stands right now is going away. All right, I'm going to move us on to something that John Micek out of MassLive reported this week. And what the heck is soft secession is the question I walked away with after I saw his column. And why it might matter for Massachusetts. So this is a story that was dropped on Wednesday in MassLive, and this idea of so-called soft secession came to the fore. And it's this notion, I'm going to double check that we don't have Micek on the phone right now. All right. I'm going to move forward and I'm going to do my best to paraphrase his reporting, that blue states can find ways to leverage their political power, their wallets, and their cultural clout to thwart the aims of sort of what's happening at the Republican level with the Trump administration without actually splitting from the union. Axios Boston reported earlier this year about the Rockefeller Institute of Government had a 2022 report that found 13 states send more money back to federal coffers than they receive. Massachusetts is the leader of that pack, the dubious distinction that nobody wants to hear about, right? What are your thoughts as you hear about this, either Evan or Aprell?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, kudos to John for reporting on this. If you Google soft secession and go to the news tab, his is one of the only articles from a real organization that's actually talking about this, because it kind of started almost as like an internet trend of labeling this thing that's people are talking about in theories. And it kind of brings me back to like UMass Poli-Sci 101 of just thinking about these like kind of ridiculous theories of like how could government work in difficult situations. Right. But I think that really withholding these tax dollars would almost be like a sanction on red states. And sanctions really hurt the most vulnerable people. As President Jimmy Carter said, I've seen how this strategy, meaning sanctions, can be cruel to innocent people. And really, I don't think now is the time to be cruel to other Americans, even if they live in a state whose party affiliation is different than ours. And I think a better strategy of kind of moving forward through this is things like the West Coast states coming together for a healthcare alliance, and we're also seeing that in New England. So instead of like, oh, we're going to separate out, coming together, I think, is a much better strategy at this time. I
think Jimmy Carter, the great peace negotiator, would agree with that.
I agree. It's divisiveness.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to move us on to our scoop, sprays, and prediction portion of the show, where we ask reporters to dish on a story that they're working on, maybe have heap some praise on a newsworthy nugget, or go crazy, go wild, and make a prediction about the week's news. Aprell, what's going on for you?
This weekend, I will be at Fashion Week, Connecticut. There are designers from Springfield, Massachusetts, into fashion designs that are going to be debuting in New Haven Fashion Week and Connecticut Fashion
Fantastic. Look forward to taking a read on that one. Evan Garber, what's on your mind this morning?
First, I just want to give some praise to a dear friend of mine, Grace Simmons, who was recently promoted to Legislative Director at Representative Minnie Dom's office. So expect to see even more great things out of that office. And I'll do a prediction since John's not here. That's political. I predict that the, like we were saying before, the Holyoke City Councilor races coming up next month, we're going to see the highest turnout in city history, where there's not a mayoral.
In an off-election year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. I think it's going to be a hotly contested race, and we are going to be talking about that here on The Rundown. My thanks to the panel, Aprell May Munford, Evan Garber, and John Micek, who tried to join us. You've been listening to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I'm Carrie Seldo. Have an amazing Friday.